The telegram arrived on Lillian Whitmore's wedding day, but not for the wedding everyone expected. While New York's finest sipped champagne in the garden below, she stood before her mirror in 60 pounds of imported silk, reading 8 words that would shatter her gilded cage. Train leaves dawn. Ticket waiting. Come if you dare. Her reflection stared back. Flawless, frozen, 23 years old, and already dying of perfection. In 6 hours, she would either marry Charles Pemberton III and disappear into ballrooms forever, or she would become someone she'd never met, herself. Before we begin this journey from Fifth Avenue to the Wyoming frontier, I invite you to stay until the very end of Lillian's story. If her courage moves you, please hit that like button and comment with your city below. I love seeing how far these tales of transformation travel across the world. The brass clock on the mantelpiece marked 3 in the morning when Lillian Whitmore made her final decision. She stood in her childhood bedroom, if a museum could be called such, surrounded by 17 years of carefully curated perfection. Oil paintings in gilded frames, a 4-poster bed draped in Venetian lace, windows that overlook Central Park, where even the trees seemed arranged for aesthetic approval. Her wedding dress hung on the wardrobe door like a ghost of the future she was about to murder. Lillian touched the silk one last time, feeling the weight of every stitch, every pearl, every expectation sewn into its seams. 3 seamstresses had worked for 4 months. Her mother had cried when she first saw it. Charles had smiled his practiced smile and told her she would be absolutely presentable. Presentable. The word still tasted like ash. She turned away from the dress and opened the bottom drawer of her escritoire, retrieving the items she'd hidden 3 weeks earlier. A wool traveling suit in practical brown, sturdy leather boots, a carpet bag already packed with clothing no one in her social circle would recognize as hers. And beneath it all, wrapped in plain paper, the advertisement she'd clipped from the Western Matrimonial News. Widowed rancher, Wyoming territory, seeks responsible woman of good character for companionship and help raising young daughter. No frills, no pretense. Honest work, honest life. Those seeking adventure need not apply. This is survival, not romance. Lillian had read it 20 times before she wrote her first letter, 50 times before she mailed it, 100 times while waiting for his reply. Jonah Hale had answered in 11 lines of practical script. His daughter was 6, his ranch was remote, his expectations were simple. Could she cook? Could she manage a household? Could she stay when things got hard? He didn't mention love. He didn't mention beauty. He asked if she could churn butter and mend fences and whether she understood that Wyoming winters could kill the unprepared. She'd written back, "I understand that staying here will kill me faster." He'd sent the train ticket. Now, with dawn creeping toward the city and her wedding scheduled for 2 o'clock, Lillian Whitmore dressed in clothes that actually allowed her to breathe. She pinned her hair in a simple knot. She left the diamonds on the vanity. She took one last look at the wedding dress and felt absolutely nothing. The note she left on her pillow was brief. "I'm sorry I couldn't be who you needed me to be. I'm going to try being who I am instead." She didn't sign it. They would know. The house was silent as she descended the servants' stairs, slipping past the kitchen where tomorrow's wedding feast lay in various stages of preparation. 200 guests, 7 courses, a cake that required its own table. All of it for a marriage that would feel exactly like this house, beautiful, suffocating, and utterly empty. The doorman, bribed in advance, pretended not to see her leave. The handsome cab was waiting at the corner, and the driver asked no questions when she gave him the address of Grand Central Station. New York before dawn was a different creature. Quiet, raw, stripped of its daytime performance. Lillian watched it slide past the window and felt something that might have been grief or might have been relief. At the station, she purchased a cup of terrible coffee and waited for the westbound train, surrounded by immigrants and laborers and people whose faces showed actual evidence of living. A woman with 3 children and a battered trunk. A man with calloused hands reading a letter that made him smile. A young couple holding each other like the world might try to separate them. No one looked at Lillian. No one cared about the cut of her traveling suit or the way she held her cup. For the first time in her remembered life, she was invisible. It was wonderful. "Train to Chicago, all aboard!" The conductor's voice shattered the pre-dawn peace. Lillian stood, lifted her carpet bag, and walked toward her future without looking back. The train to Chicago took 16 hours. Chicago to Cheyenne took 3 days. By the time Lillian transferred to the territorial line that would carry her to Redwood Basin, Wyoming, she'd been traveling for nearly a week, and every mile had stripped away another layer of the person she used to be. The dining cars grew simpler, the passengers grew rougher, the landscape through the windows transformed from cities to farmland to endless prairie that seemed to swallow the sky. Lillian watched it all with her face pressed to the glass, feeling simultaneously terrified and more awake than she'd ever been. In Cheyenne, she bought practical supplies, work dresses, aprons, a sturdy coat, gloves meant for labor rather than fashion. The shopkeeper, a weathered woman with kind eyes, had looked at her carefully. Mail-order bride. Lillian had hesitated, then nodded. First time west? Yes. The woman had packed extra wool stockings without charging for them. Winter comes early in the Basin country. Man doesn't always think to mention that in his letters. She'd paused, measuring Lillian with a long look. You running from something or running to something? I'm not entirely sure yet. Well, the woman had tied the package with firm hands. Either way, Wyoming doesn't care who you used to be. Out here, you're just who you prove yourself to be, minute by minute, day by day. Those words echoed in Lillian's mind as the territorial train carried her deeper into country that seemed determined to remind humans exactly how small they were. Mountains that dwarfed anything she'd imagined, valleys that stretched forever, skies so enormous it felt like falling upward just to look at it. The other passengers thinned with each stop, a family of homesteaders disembarking at a station that was just a platform and a hope, a prospector getting off at a crossroads that led to nothing Lillian could see. By the time the conductor called Redwood Basin, she was one of only 3 people left in the car. The platform at Redwood Basin didn't deserve the name. It was weathered planks and a leaning post, set against a landscape of rolling grassland broken by distant pine-covered ridges. A single building squatted nearby, general store and post office combined from the looks of it. 3 horses waited at a hitching rail. The wind carried the smell of sage and dust and something vast and unknowable. Lillian stepped off the train with her carpet bag and looked around for someone who might be Jonah Hale. A man stood near the horses, tall, lean, weathered in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with exposure. He wore work clothes faded from sun and washing, canvas pants, a plain shirt, a hat pulled low. His face was hard to read, all shadows and angles, but his eyes were clear and gray as winter sky. He was looking directly at her. Lillian's heart did something complicated in her chest. This man was nothing like Charles Pemberton III with his soft hands and softer smile. Nothing like any man she'd ever stood in a ballroom with, trading pleasantries that meant nothing. This man looked like he'd been carved from the same stone as the mountains, and just as likely to be moved by charm or flattery. She walked toward him, trying to remember how to breathe. Mr. Hale? He nodded once. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet and rough, like he didn't waste it often. Miss Whitmore. Not a question, a confirmation. Yes. She set down her bag, suddenly aware of how she must look. Travel-stained, wind-blown, probably foolish. I'm Lillian. Jonah. He glanced at her carpet bag. That all you brought? I left most of my life behind. Something flickered in his eyes, not quite surprise, not quite approval. Might make things simpler. He picked up her bag without ceremony and started toward the horses. It's 8 miles to the ranch. Road's rough. You ride? Lillian looked at the horses, real working animals, not the groomed creatures from Central Park bridle paths. I've been on a horse. That's not what I asked. No, she admitted. Not really. Jonah studied her for a moment, then moved to the calmer looking of the 2 horses, a sturdy bay mare with patient eyes. This is Steady. She's earned the name. Keep your heels down, hands light. She'll do the rest. He helped Lillian into the saddle with impersonal efficiency, adjusting the stirrups with quick, certain movements. Hurts? Everything hurt after a week on trains, but Lillian shook her head. I'm fine. You'll say that until you're not. Out here, that's how people die. He swung onto his own horse, a rangy sorrel gelding that looked as no-nonsense as its rider. You feel wrong. You speak up. Understood? Understood. They rode in silence. Lillian quickly discovered that she was, in fact, not fine. Her back ached, her legs screamed, and Steady's patient plodding felt like a physical education in humility. But she kept her teeth together and her complaints silent, watching the landscape roll past with a mixture of awe and growing dread. This was so far from anything she knew, so far from help, from familiarity, from the world where she understood the rules. The vastness of it pressed down like a physical weight, mountains in the distance, grass bending under wind, sky that went on forever. And this silent man riding ahead of her, leading her toward a life she couldn't begin to imagine. What had she done? After an hour, Jonah slowed his horse and turned to check on her. Whatever he saw made him nod slightly. "You're doing fine." "You said not to say that until I'm not." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. "I said you shouldn't say it. I can say it when it's true." He gestured ahead. "Another mile. You'll see the house when we top the next rise." They climbed the gentle slope in silence. At the crest, Jonah stopped his horse and waited for Lillian to come alongside. The valley spread below them, cradled between pine-covered ridges, a creek cutting silver through the grass. The house sat in the center, a simple structure of weathered wood and stone, single story, built low against the wind. A barn stood nearby, solid and practical. A corral held several horses. Behind it all, the mountains rose like promises or warnings, depending on how you looked at them. It was the loneliest, most beautiful thing Lillian had ever seen. "That's home," Jonah said quietly. "Such as it is. Home." The word felt strange. Lillian had lived in a mansion with 20 rooms, but she'd never called it that. This rough collection of buildings in the middle of nowhere, could this be home? She didn't have words. "Small," Jonah finished for her. "Simple. Long way from anything. If you're having second thoughts, I can take you back to town tomorrow. No shame in it. This life isn't for everyone." Lillian looked at the valley, then at the man beside her. This stranger she'd agreed to marry. This man who was already offering her an escape route before she'd even arrived. Something about that steadied her. "I didn't come all this way to turn around at the first glimpse of difficult." Jonah studied her with those winter sky eyes. "No," he said slowly. "I suppose you didn't." He touched his heels to his horse. "Come on. May will be watching for us." May, his daughter, the 6-year-old who was the real reason Lillian was here. They rode down into the valley, and Lillian felt the weight of her choice settling around her shoulders like Jonah's coat would on a cold morning. Unfamiliar, heavy, but somehow right. Debt. The house was smaller inside than it looked from the ridge. One main room that served as kitchen and living space, with a stone fireplace taking up most of one wall. 2 doors led to what must be bedrooms. Everything was clean, but spare. Wooden table, simple chairs, a rocking chair near the fire, shelves holding dishes and supplies. No decoration, no softness, nothing that wasn't absolutely necessary. A child stood near the fireplace, half hidden in shadow. "May," Jonah said quietly, removing his hat. "This is Miss Whitmore. Lillian." He glanced at Lillian. "My daughter, May." The child was tiny, with her father's gray eyes and dark hair that hung in careful braids. She wore a simple dress that looked too big, as if she were waiting to grow into it. She didn't speak, didn't move, just watched Lillian with an expression that was simultaneously ancient and utterly vulnerable. Lillian's heart cracked a little. She'd been prepared for a grieving child, a difficult child, perhaps even a hostile child. She hadn't been prepared for this. A little girl who looked like she'd learned to take up as little space as possible, to need as little as she could manage. She knelt slowly, making herself small, non-threatening. "Hello, May. It's very nice to meet you." May looked at her father. "It's all right," Jonah said softly. There was something in his voice, a gentleness Lillian hadn't heard before. "You can speak to her." But May didn't speak. She just kept watching Lillian with those enormous eyes, and after a long moment she gave the smallest nod imaginable and turned away, disappearing through one of the bedroom doors. The silence that followed felt like a living thing. "She doesn't talk much," Jonah said finally, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. Hasn't since her mother passed. 2 years now. He moved to the stove, checking the fire with practiced motions. She's not simple. She understands everything, just doesn't see the point in words, I suppose. Lillian stood, brushing dust from her skirt. How old was she when... 4. Jonah's hand stilled on the stove. Old enough to remember, not old enough to understand. He was quiet for a moment. Sarah, my wife. She was the one who filled this house with sound, singing, talking, laughing. When she died, the silence came in like winter. May just accepted it, like it was natural. And you? Lillian asked gently. Jonah looked at her, and for just a moment she saw past the weathered exterior to the grief he carried like stones in his pockets. I accepted it too, didn't see another choice. He turned back to the stove. Your room is through that door. May's is the other. I sleep in the barn loft most nights. Seemed appropriate. Lillian understood what he wasn't saying. This marriage was a practical arrangement. He wasn't expecting a wife in the traditional sense. He was expecting help, a caretaker, someone to share the burden of raising a silent child in a silent house. Mr. Hale, Jonah. The name felt strange on her tongue. I should be clear about something. I didn't come here to replace anyone. I don't imagine I could, but I did come here to be useful, to try. I'll make mistakes. I've never lived like this, never done this kind of work. But I'll learn, if you'll be patient with my ignorance. He turned to face her fully for the first time since they'd entered the house. You could have married someone in New York, someone who would have given you an easy life. I had an easy life. It was killing me by inches. Lillian met his eyes. I came here because I wanted to find out if I was capable of something real, even if it's difficult, especially if it's difficult. Jonah studied her in that way he had, like he could see past all the words to what lay beneath. Finally, he nodded. We'll see then. You should rest. Tomorrow starts early. He moved toward the door, clearly heading for the barn. Jonah! He paused, hand on the doorframe. Thank you, Lillian said, for the chance. He didn't answer, just nodded once more and disappeared into the evening, leaving Lillian alone in the silent house with a child who didn't speak and a future she couldn't begin to predict. Through the closed bedroom door, she could hear nothing. No crying, no movement, just silence, thick and complete. Lillian walked to her room, a small space with a narrow bed, a washstand, a hook on the wall for her clothes. Through the single window, she could see the mountains going purple in the dying light. So far from Fifth Avenue, so far from everything she'd known. She sat on the bed and let herself feel the full weight of what she'd done, the terror of it, the absolute insanity of marrying a stranger and moving to the edge of the world based on 11 lines of practical script and a gut feeling that staying would have been worse than leaving. Then she stood, unpacked her carpet bag, and laid out her clothes for tomorrow. Whatever came next, she would face it. She'd come too far to do anything else. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows with the sound of a wilderness that cared nothing for human hopes or fears. Somewhere in the gathering dark, Jonah Hale was settling into the barn loft, and his daughter was lying silent in her room, and Lillian Whitmore was beginning the strangest chapter of her life. She blew out the lamp and lay in the darkness, listening to the wind, wondering what dawn would bring. Dawn brought the rooster at an hour Lillian's body insisted was still deep night. She dragged herself from bed, dressed in one of her new work dresses, and emerged from her room to find the house still silent, but the stove already warm. Through the window, she could see Jonah moving between the barn and corral, his movements efficient and unhurried. May sat at the table, dressed and braided, eating a bowl of cornmeal mush. Good morning, Lillian said softly. May looked up, gave that same small nod, and returned her attention to her bowl. Lillian moved to the stove, found the pot of mush staying warm, and served herself a portion. It was plain, filling, and utterly unlike anything that had ever appeared on her mother's breakfast table. She sat across from May and ate in silence, unsure what else to do. After a few minutes, Jonah came in, bringing the smell of horses and morning cold with him. He glanced at them both, nodded, and poured himself coffee from the pot on the stove. May has lessons after morning chores, he said, not looking at Lillian directly. She can read and cipher some. Sarah started teaching her. I've kept it up, but he trailed off. If you have learning, might be you could help with that. I can read, Lillian said, and write. I had tutors for literature, history, French. French won't help much with survival out here. But reading's good. May needs that. He drained his coffee in 3 swallows. I'll show you around the place this morning. What needs doing, how things work. You'll have questions. Better to ask them now than to guess wrong later. For the next 2 hours, Jonah walked Lillian through the ranch with the same practical efficiency he seemed to apply to everything. The chickens needed feeding and water, eggs collected daily. The milk cow needed milking twice a day. The vegetable garden, now mostly frost-killed for the season, would need tending come spring. Firewood needed splitting and stacking. Water needed hauling from the creek. Bread needed baking. Clothes needed washing. The list went on and on, each task simple in description but requiring knowledge Lillian simply didn't have. She watched Jonah's hands as he demonstrated, milking the cow, feeding the chickens, checking the horse's hooves. Capable hands, scarred and calloused, moving with the certainty of long practice. He didn't waste motion, didn't waste words, just showed her what needed doing and waited to see if she could follow. By mid-morning, Lillian's back ached. Her hands were raw from hauling water buckets, and she'd managed to anger the chickens, confuse the cow, and nearly drop an entire basket of eggs. Jonah watched it all with no visible reaction, then quietly took the egg basket from her before disaster struck. It takes time, he said simply. Sarah grew up on a farm. She knew all this before she came here. You'll learn. Will I learn before I accidentally kill something? That almost smile flickered again. Chickens are tougher than they look. They walked back toward the house, and Lillian realized May was sitting on the porch steps, watching them. The child had a slate and a piece of chalk, and she'd been drawing something, rough shapes that might have been horses, or might have been clouds. May's turn for lessons, Jonah said. I need to ride fence this afternoon, check for breaks before winter. He looked at Lillian. You'll be all right here? The question felt like a test. Lillian looked at May, who was watching her with those serious gray eyes, and felt the weight of what was actually being asked. Can you be trusted with my daughter? Can you be left alone with the most precious thing I have? We'll be fine, Lillian said, hoping it was true. Jonah held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded. He walked to May, knelt beside her, and spoke too quietly for Lillian to hear. May nodded, and Jonah touched her hair gently before standing and heading to the barn. Lillian watched him ride out, then turned to find May still sitting on the steps, slate abandoned, watching her. Well, Lillian said softly, settling onto the steps beside her, not too close, leaving space. Your father says you have lessons. Would you like to show me what you're learning? May didn't respond with words, but after a moment, she picked up her slate and carefully wrote 3 letters, C-A-T. Cat, Lillian read. That's very good. Can you write dog? May considered this, then wrote D-O-G. Excellent. What about... Lillian paused, thinking. What about your name? Can you write May? The child's face changed slightly. Not quite a smile, but something softer than the careful blankness she'd shown before. She wiped the slate clean and wrote M-A-E. Perfect. Lillian felt something loosen in her chest. This was a start. Small, fragile, but real. You know what? I think you're probably a better student than I am. I'm going to need you to teach me things about living here. Would you do that? May tilted her head, studying Lillian with an intensity that felt much older than 6 years. Then, so quietly Lillian almost missed it, the child spoke. Pa says you came from far away. Lillian's breath caught. She kept her voice calm, gentle. I did. Very far. A place called New York City. Is it bigger than Redwood Basin? Much bigger. So big you can't see the sky properly. Too many buildings in the way. May absorbed this, her small face serious. Why'd you leave? It was a child's question, but it deserved an honest answer. Lillian thought carefully. Because I was lonely in a place full of people. I thought maybe I'd be less lonely somewhere quieter, with people who said what they meant. May looked down at her slate, tracing the letters of her name with one finger. When she spoke again, it was barely a whisper. Ma used to sing all the time. Now it's quiet. Lillian felt tears prick her eyes. She didn't try to touch May, didn't try to offer comfort that might feel like invasion. She just sat beside her in the morning sun and spoke the truth. I don't know your mother's songs, but if you'd like sometime, I could teach you songs I know. They're probably different, but they're something. May didn't answer, but she didn't move away either. They sat together on the porch steps, the silence between them somehow less heavy than it had been, and Lillian thought maybe, just maybe, she'd taken the first real step into this strange new life. Inside the house, the clock ticked. In the corral, horses dozed in the sun, and somewhere on the far ridge, Jonah Hale rode fence line, trusting Lillian Whitmore with the most important thing in his carefully controlled world. The day stretched ahead, full of tasks Lillian didn't know how to do, and a future she couldn't predict. But for the first time since stepping off that train, she felt something that might have been hope. It was a start, nothing more. But sometimes, a start is everything. The afternoon sun was slanting through the kitchen window when Lillian finally admitted to herself that she had no idea how to make bread. She'd watched the dough rise, or fail to rise more accurately, for the past 2 hours while May worked on her letters at the table. The lumpy mass in the bowl looked nothing like the smooth, elastic dough she'd seen the cook handle back in New York, and it certainly bore no resemblance to the golden loaves that had appeared on her mother's table each morning. May had been watching her with increasing concern for the last 20 minutes. "It's supposed to be bigger," the child finally whispered. Lillian looked at the dough, then at May. "I know. Ma's always got bigger." "I'm sure it did." Lillian poked the dough experimentally. It poked back, stubborn and dense. "I'm beginning to think bread making might be a skill that requires actual knowledge rather than optimistic guessing." May's eyes widened slightly. The closest thing to alarm Lillian had seen on her face. "Pa needs bread. For tomorrow." The weight of that simple statement settled over Lillian like a physical thing. Of course Jonah needed bread. Men who worked from dawn until dark needed food, real food, not the decorative arrangements Lillian had picked at during garden parties. This wasn't about impressing anyone with culinary artistry. This was about basic survival, and she was failing at it before she'd even properly begun. "Right," Lillian said, straightening her shoulders. "Then we'd better figure this out. Do you know where your mother kept her receipt book?" May slid off her chair and disappeared into Jonah's room, the room that had been his and Sarah's, Lillian supposed, though he no longer slept there. She returned carrying a small, worn notebook, its pages stained and creased from use. May held it out to Lillian with both hands, like it was something precious. "Ma wrote everything down," May said softly. "Pa says it's so she wouldn't forget, but Ma never forgot nothing." Lillian took the book gently, aware she was holding something sacred. Sarah Hale's handwriting was neat and practical, each receipt written with clear measurements and simple instructions. Bread, biscuits, stew, pie crust, remedies for fever and cough, notes on when to plant which vegetables. An entire life of knowledge, preserved in ink and passed to a stranger who was trying to fill an impossible space. She found the bread receipt and read it 3 times, comparing Sarah's instructions to what she'd already done wrong. Too much flour, not enough time for rising, water that was probably too cold, a dozen small errors that added up to failure. "Well," Lillian said, meeting May's worried gaze, "I think we might need to start over. Would you help me?" May nodded seriously, and together they began again. This time, Lillian followed Sarah's instructions exactly, and May proved to be a capable assistant, fetching flour, checking the water temperature with her small hand, watching the clock to time each step. The child didn't speak much, but she paid attention with an intensity that reminded Lillian of Jonah, and when she did offer guidance, it was always useful. "Ma used to punch it," May said when the dough had risen properly, and Lillian stood staring at it uncertainly. "Punch it?" May demonstrated with her small fist, pressing into the air. "To get the air out. Then you make it into loaves." So Lillian punched the dough, feeling slightly ridiculous, and May watched approvingly. Together they shaped 2 loaves, lumpy and uneven compared to what Sarah would have made, probably, but recognizable as bread. May helped slide them into the oven, and they both stood watching through the door, as if the loaves might escape if left unattended. "You really didn't know how to make bread?" May asked after a while, her voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than judgment. "I really didn't. Where I came from, other people made the bread. I just ate it." May considered this. That sounds lonely. The observation was so unexpected, so quietly perceptive, that Lillian had to take a moment before responding. "It was, actually. I never thought about it that way, but you're right. It was very lonely." They stood together in the warmth of the kitchen, watching bread bake, and Lillian felt the strangeness of it all. That she'd traveled 2,000 miles to learn basic survival skills from a 6-year-old girl who barely spoke. That this cramped, simple house felt more like a home after 2 days than the mansion she'd lived in for 23 years. That this silent child, with her serious gray eyes and her careful words, was teaching Lillian what it meant to actually live inside your own life. When Jonah came home as the sun was setting, tired and dusty from riding fence, he stopped in the doorway and just looked at them. Lillian and May were setting the table together, and 2 slightly misshapen but thoroughly edible loaves of bread sat cooling on the counter. "You made bread," he said, and there was something in his voice Lillian couldn't quite identify. "May made bread," Lillian corrected. "I mostly made mistakes until she showed me how to fix them." Jonah's eyes moved to his daughter, and the expression on his face made Lillian's throat tighten. It was love, pure and uncomplicated, mixed with a grief so deep it had no bottom. He walked to May, knelt down to her level, and spoke quietly. "You helped?" May nodded. "That was kind of you." "She didn't know Ma's way, so I showed her." Jonah was silent for a long moment, one hand resting gently on May's shoulder. When he spoke again, his voice was rough. "Your Ma would be proud of you, being helpful, being patient." He paused. "I'm proud of you." May leaned against him slightly, and he wrapped his arms around her, holding her like she was the only thing keeping him anchored to the earth. Lillian turned away, giving them privacy, busying herself with dishes that didn't need busying with. Some moments weren't meant to be witnessed by outsiders, even outsiders who lived in the same house. They ate dinner in relative quiet. The bread was dense but edible. The stew Lillian had managed not to burn was simple but filling. Jonah ate with the focus of a man who'd worked hard and needed fuel, and May picked at her food with typical 6-year-old disinterest. But there was something different in the silence now. It felt less like absence and more like peace. After dinner, while Lillian washed dishes, Jonah sat with May by the fire and listened to her recite her letters. His voice was patient as he corrected her mistakes, warm when he praised her successes. Lillian watched them from the corner of her eye and saw the father Sarah's death had almost erased. The man who might have laughed more easily, held his daughter without that shadow of desperation, lived inside his own skin without carrying stones in every pocket. When May started yawning, Jonah carried her to bed. Lillian heard their quiet voices through the door, his low rumble, her sleepy murmurs, and then silence. He emerged a few minutes later, closing the door softly behind him. "She settled?" Lillian asked. "She did." Jonah moved to the fire, standing with his back to the warmth. "She talked today, more than usual." "She did," Lillian agreed carefully. "That's because of you." Lillian set down the dish she'd been drying. "I think that's because May decided it was time. I just happened to be here." Jonah studied her with those winter gray eyes. "You're kind to her, patient. That matters more than bread." "The bread matters too. Men need to eat. Men can eat bad bread if they have to. Children need kindness. That's harder to come by." He was quiet for a moment, his face shadowed by firelight. "Sarah used to say that silence could be a kindness or cruelty, depending on what you filled it with. I never understood what she meant until after she was gone." Lillian waited, sensing he had more to say. "I filled it with work," Jonah continued. "Thought if I just kept moving, kept fixing things, kept the ranch running, that would be enough. That May would be all right because we survived. But surviving isn't the same as living. Sarah knew that. I forgot. It's not too late to remember." He looked at her sharply. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I don't," Lillian admitted. I don't know what it's like to lose someone you love. I don't know what it's like to raise a child alone. But I know what it's like to be so afraid of living wrong that you stop living at all. And I know May needs more than survival. Jonah's jaw tightened, and for a moment Lillian thought she'd pushed too far, spoken too boldly about things that weren't her business. But then his shoulders dropped slightly, and he turned back to the fire. Sarah used to sing while she worked, every day. Didn't matter if she was happy or tired or angry, she sang. The house was never quiet when she was alive. His voice was barely above a whisper. When she died, the silence came in like water, and I let it, because the singing hurt worse than the quiet. Every song reminded me she was gone. Lillian moved to stand beside him, not touching, but close enough to offer presence. May told me her mother used to sing. She asked you to sing? No, she asked me why I left New York. That surprised him. What did you tell her? The truth. That I was lonely in a place full of people, and I wanted to find out if I could be less lonely somewhere quieter, with people who said what they meant. Jonah turned to look at her fully. You think this place is less lonely? Lillian met his eyes. I think it has the possibility to be, if we're brave enough to let it. They stood there in the firelight, two people who'd both run from different kinds of death, trying to figure out how to build something like life from the wreckage of their choices. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows with Wyoming's endless breath. Inside, the fire crackled, and somewhere in the darkness May slept, and the silence between Jonah and Lillian felt less like a wall and more like a question neither of them knew how to answer yet. I should let you rest, Jonah said finally, stepping away from the fire. Tomorrow's Sunday. We don't work as hard, but there's still animals to tend. I'll be ready. He nodded, moving toward the door, but paused with his hand on the frame. Lillian? It was the first time he'd used her name directly, without hesitation. Yes? Thank you. For being patient with May, for trying with the bread, for... He trailed off, struggling with words. For being here. Before Lillian could respond, he was gone, disappeared into the night toward the barn. She stood alone in the kitchen, her hands still damp from washing dishes, her heart doing something complicated in her chest, and wondered what kind of future could be built from thank yous and almost smiles and the slow thawing of a man who'd frozen himself to survive. She banked the fire, checked that May's door was closed, and retreated to her own small room. Through the window, she could see a lamp burning in the barn loft. Jonah, awake in his exile, keeping watch over a ranch and a daughter, and maybe, just maybe, starting to believe that life might be worth more than simple survival. Lillian lay in the darkness and listened to the wind, and for the first time since arriving, she didn't feel afraid of what morning would bring. The next weeks unfolded in a rhythm that was simultaneously exhausting and strangely comforting. Lillian learned to milk the cow without getting kicked, to gather eggs without terrorizing the chickens, to bake bread that didn't require a hammer to slice. She burned stew, oversalted soup, and once managed to set a dish rag on fire. But May was patient with her failures and generous with instruction, and slowly, so slowly, Lillian began to feel less like an imposter and more like someone who actually belonged in this rough-hewn life. Jonah watched her struggle with no visible judgment, occasionally stepping in when disaster loomed, but mostly letting her learn through error. He taught her to split kindling without taking off a finger, to read the sky for coming weather, to understand the sounds the animals made when something was wrong. His teaching method was practical and sparse. Show once, correct as needed, trust her to figure out the rest. It was nothing like the elaborate instruction she'd received in watercolors and French, but it was infinitely more useful. May continued to surprise her. The child who'd seemed made of silence proved to have opinions about everything once she decided Lillian could be trusted. She didn't like carrots, but would eat them if Lillian added butter. She preferred her hair in braids, but only if they weren't too tight. She could read better than Lillian had expected, sounding out words from Sarah's book of Bible stories with careful concentration. And she had a memory like a steel trap. Once shown how something should be done, she never forgot. Ma said I got that from her, May told Lillian one afternoon while they were folding laundry together. Remembering things. Pa forgets where he puts his hat sometimes, but Ma never forgot nothing important. Your mother sounds like she was a remarkable woman. May nodded seriously, smoothing a wrinkle from one of Jonah's shirts. She was pretty. Not like the pretty in magazines. Pa showed me one once at the store. Ma was pretty like the mountains when the sun hits them right. You know? Lillian's throat tightened. I think that's the best kind of pretty there is. Are you pretty? The question was so genuinely curious, so devoid of judgment, that Lillian had to smile. I used to be, by magazine standards. That's actually part of why I left. May frowned, puzzling through this. People can leave because they're too pretty? People can leave because everyone only cares about them being pretty and forgets to care about the rest of them. This seemed to make sense to May. She folded in silence for a while, then asked quietly, "Do you think Pa thinks you're pretty?" Lillian froze, unsure how to answer. "I don't know. I don't think your father thinks about things like that very much. He looks at you sometimes, when you're not watching." "May, I'm just saying, he looks different than he used to, less like he's carrying something real heavy." Before Lillian could respond to that observation, the door opened and Jonah himself appeared, covered in dust from working the woodpile. He stopped when he saw them together, surrounded by folded laundry and easy conversation. "Didn't mean to interrupt." "You're not," Lillian said quickly. "We're just finishing." May gathered her stack of folded clothes and carried them to her room, leaving Jonah and Lillian alone. He moved to the water bucket, washing his hands and face with the same efficient movements he applied to everything. "She's talking more," he said finally, drying his hands on a towel. "She is. She's a bright child." "She is." Jonah hung the towel carefully. "She likes you." "I like her too." He turned to face her, and Lillian saw something in his expression that hadn't been there before, a kind of cautious hope, fragile as new ice on a winter pond. "This arrangement, it's working better than I expected." "Is that surprising?" "It is, actually. I thought—" He stopped, choosing words carefully. "I thought having someone else in the house would feel like betrayal. To Sarah. To the life we had. But it doesn't. It feels like something else, something I don't have words for yet." Lillian's heart was beating too fast. "What does it feel like?" Jonah held her gaze, and in his eyes she saw the man he might have been before grief carved him hollow, the man who might still exist somewhere beneath all that careful control. Like maybe the silence doesn't have to be permanent. The moment stretched between them, delicate and dangerous, full of possibilities neither of them knew how to name. Then May called from her room, needing help with something, and the moment broke like glass. Jonah stepped back and Lillian turned away, and they both pretended something significant hadn't just happened. But it had. They both knew it. That night, after May was asleep and the dishes were done, Lillian sat alone by the fire and tried to understand what was happening to her. She'd come here expecting practical arrangements and useful work. She'd come here expecting to earn her place through labor and patience. She hadn't come here expecting to care about a silent child who spoke in whispers and watched the world with ancient eyes. She hadn't come here expecting to be moved by a man who'd taught himself not to feel anything because feeling was too dangerous. She definitely hadn't come here expecting to feel this careful, growing warmth in her chest whenever Jonah looked at her like she might be something more than just hired help. Through the window, she could see the lamp burning in the barn loft. Jonah, keeping his distance, maintaining the boundaries they'd both agreed to. But those boundaries were starting to feel less like safety and more like cowardice, and Lillian wasn't sure what to do about that. She was still sitting there, staring at the fire, when she heard the soft sound of bare feet on wood. May stood in her nightgown, hair loose around her shoulders, looking small and lost. "Can't sleep?" Lillian asked gently. May shook her head, then moved closer to the fire, to Lillian. "Sometimes I dream Ma's still here. Then I wake up, and she's not. And the not here feels worse than if I just remembered all the time." Lillian's heart broke clean in half. She opened her arms slightly, an invitation, not a demand, and May hesitated for just a moment before stepping into them. The child was warm and small and real, and Lillian held her carefully, like she might shatter. "I'm sorry," Lillian whispered. "I'm so sorry your mama isn't here. Pa says she's in heaven, watching over us." "I'm sure she is." May was quiet against Lillian's shoulder. then said in a voice almost too soft to hear, "Do you think she minds that you're here now?" Lillian closed her eyes, feeling the weight of that question. "I think your mama loved you and your father so much that she'd want you both to be happy, even if that means having someone new around. Are you new, or are you staying?" "I'm staying, sweetheart, as long as you and your father want me to." May pulled back slightly, looking up at Lillian with those gray eyes that saw too much. "Pa wants you to stay. He's just scared to say it." "Scared of what?" "Scared that if he loves something again, it'll go away, like Ma did." The simple, terrible wisdom of it struck Lillian breathless. This child understood her father better than he understood himself, saw through his careful walls to the truth he worked so hard to hide. "What about you?" Lillian asked gently. "Are you scared too?" May thought about this seriously. "A little, but mostly I'm just tired of being quiet all the time. It's lonely." "Then don't be quiet. Not with me. You can say anything you want, and I'll listen." May studied her face for a long moment, then nodded and settled back against Lillian's shoulder. They sat together by the dying fire, woman and child, both of them refugees from different kinds of loneliness, both of them learning that family wasn't always blood, and home wasn't always the place you started. Eventually, May's breathing evened into sleep, and Lillian carried her back to bed, tucking her in with a tenderness that came from somewhere deep and unexpected. She stood in the doorway for a moment, watching the child sleep, and understood with sudden clarity that she would do anything to protect this small, brave soul. That somewhere in this past few weeks, May had stopped being Jonah's daughter, and had become simply May, someone Lillian loved, full stop, no qualifications required. She returned to the main room and found Jonah standing by the fire, still dressed, clearly just returned from the barn. He must have seen the lamp still burning and come to check. "May?" he asked. "Bad dream." She settled now. Jonah nodded, but didn't move toward his barn loft exile. Instead, he stood there, firelight carving shadows into his face, looking at Lillian like he was trying to solve an equation that didn't have numbers. "Thank you," he said finally, "for comforting her. I heard her get up, but I wasn't sure. I didn't know if I should. You can always come in, Jonah. This is your house. Doesn't feel like mine anymore. Hasn't, since Sarah died." He moved closer to the fire, closer to Lillian. "Feels like I've been a ghost in my own life for 2 years, going through motions, making sure May survived, but not really being." Lillian waited, sensing he had more to say. "You being here, it's waking things up I thought were dead. And I don't know if that's good or if it's just going to hurt worse when—" He stopped. "When what?" "When you realize this life is too hard. When you decide you made a mistake. When you leave." There it was, the fear May had named so clearly. Lillian stepped closer, close enough to see the tension in his jaw, the careful way he held himself like he was made of glass that might shatter at the wrong touch. "I'm not leaving, Jonah. I didn't come this far to run at the first sign of difficult. I came here because I wanted something real, even if it's hard, especially if it's hard. You say that now? I say that now, and I'll say it tomorrow, and I'll keep saying it until you believe me." Her voice was fierce, surprising them both. "I know you loved Sarah. I know losing her nearly destroyed you. But I'm not trying to be her, and I'm not asking you to forget her. I'm just asking you to believe that maybe there's room for something new, something different, something that honors what you had while still letting you have a future." Jonah stared at her, and in his eyes she saw the war between hope and fear, between the man who wanted to believe her and the man who couldn't risk being destroyed again. "I don't know how to do that," he whispered. "Neither do I. But maybe we can figure it out together." They stood there in the firelight, close enough to touch but not touching, and the silence between them felt alive with possibility. Then Jonah reached out slowly, carefully, and touched Lillian's hand, just the backs of his fingers against hers, the lightest possible contact. "Stay," he said quietly. "Please stay." "I'm staying." He nodded, then withdrew his hand and stepped back, returning to safer distance. But something had changed. Some wall had developed a crack, and through that crack, light was beginning to show. "Good night, Lillian." "Good night, Jonah." He left for the barn, and she went to her room, and outside the wind sang through the valley with Wyoming's endless voice. But inside, in the silence of the house, something new was growing, tentative, fragile but real. It would take time. It would take patience. It would take courage from all three of them. But for the first time since arriving, Lillian believed they actually had a chance. Winter arrived like a predator, patient and inevitable. Lillian woke one morning in early November to find the world transformed, snow covering everything in silence deeper than any quiet the house had known. Through her window, the mountains had disappeared into white sky, and the valley looked like something from a dream, beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. She dressed quickly in the cold room, layering every warm thing she owned, and emerged to find Jonah already up, standing at the window with a cup of coffee and an expression that told her the storm was more than just pretty scenery. "How bad?" she asked. He didn't turn from the window. "Bad enough. This is early, even for Wyoming. We'll need to bring the horses closer, make sure the chickens don't freeze, double the firewood inside. May needs to stay in today. Wind's too strong for a child." As if summoned by her name, May appeared from her room, wrapped in a quilt and looking small as a mouse. "Is it the big snow, Pa?" "Might be, little bird. Might just be a taste of what's coming." He finally turned from the window, and Lillian saw the calculation in his eyes, the mental list of everything that needed doing, everything that could go wrong. "You'll stay inside with Lillian, help with what needs helping. Understand?" May nodded solemnly. She understood better than most that Wyoming weather wasn't something to argue with. Jonah pulled on his heavy coat, wound a scarf around his face, and looked at Lillian. "Keep the fire going. If I'm not back in 2 hours, don't come looking. I'll make it back." "Jonah?" "I will." He said it with such flat certainty that Lillian had to believe him. Men who survived in this country learned to promise only what they could deliver. He left, and the wind swallowed him within seconds. Lillian stood at the window, watching the place where he'd disappeared, feeling a new kind of fear she hadn't anticipated. It wasn't the genteel worry of whether a gentleman would arrive on time for tea. It was the primitive terror of knowing someone you cared about was fighting for survival against forces that didn't care if he lived or died. "Pa always comes back," May said quietly from behind her. "He promised Ma he would. And Pa keeps promises." Lillian turned to find the child watching her with knowing eyes. "Of course he does." "You're scared, though." There was no point lying to May. The child saw through everything. "A little. I've never seen weather like this. You get used to it, or you learn to be scared smart instead of scared stupid." May moved to the stove, checking the fire with the competence of someone twice her age. "Ma used to say scared stupid makes you freeze. Scared smart makes you work. So we should work." It was so perfectly sensible, so utterly practical, that Lillian had to smile despite her anxiety. "Your mother was a wise woman." "She was. Pa says I'm like her. I think maybe you are too, a little bit." The compliment was given so casually, so matter-of-factly, that it took Lillian's breath. She knelt down to May's level. "That might be the nicest thing anyone's ever said to me." May tilted her head, studying Lillian's face. People in New York must have been awful strange then. Not saying nice, true things. "They were very strange. I'm glad I left." "I'm glad too." May reached out and touched Lillian's hand briefly, then turned away, suddenly shy. "We should make soup. Paul'll be cold when he comes back." So they made soup, and Lillian tried not to watch the clock, tried not to calculate how long Jonah had been gone, tried not to imagine all the ways a man could disappear into a Wyoming blizzard. May chatted while they worked, her words coming easier now, telling stories about her mother and the ranch, and the time a bear came down from the mountains and Jonah had to fire his rifle in the air to scare it off. "Were you afraid?" Lillian asked. "Terrified. But Ma held me and sang, and somehow the singing made it less scary. Like if she could sing, then everything must be okay." Lillian stirred the soup, thinking about Sarah Hale, this woman she'd never met, but whose presence filled every corner of this house. A woman who sang through fear and wrote recipes in careful script, and loved her husband and daughter with the kind of fierce devotion that didn't die just because your heart stopped beating. "What did she sing?" Lillian asked softly. May thought about it. All sorts of things. Hymns mostly, but sometimes just songs she made up, about the mountains or the horses or Pa being stubborn as old leather. She smiled at the memory. He'd pretend to be annoyed, but he liked it. You could tell. Do you remember any of them? May's face grew uncertain. Some, but I don't sing anymore. Doesn't feel right without Ma. Lillian understood. Silence was May's way of honoring her mother, of keeping something sacred untouched. But she also understood what Sarah would have wanted, not a daughter frozen in grief, but a daughter who lived. Your mother's songs don't disappear just because she's gone, Lillian said gently. They're still here, in you. And maybe someday, when you're ready, you'll sing them again. Not because you're trying to bring her back, but because you're carrying her forward. May looked at her with those gray eyes that seemed older than any child should be. You think Ma would like that? I think your mother would like anything that makes you happy. They worked in silence for a while after that, but it was a comfortable silence, the kind that meant thinking rather than hurting. The soup bubbled on the stove, filling the house with warmth and the smell of comfort. Outside, the wind howled like something alive and angry, but inside, Lillian and May had created a small island of safety. When Jonah finally came through the door an hour and 45 minutes after leaving, he was covered in snow from hat to boots, his face raw from wind, his hands clumsy with cold. Lillian rushed to help him out of his coat while May brought him coffee, and together they guided him to the fire like he was something precious that might break if handled wrong. Animals are secure, he said through chattering teeth. Horses in the near corral, chickens locked tight, enough wood to last the week if we're careful. Are we stuck here? Lillian asked. For a few days at least. Maybe longer. He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup, and Lillian saw they were bleeding from splits in the skin. This is Wyoming teaching you its rules. Winter here doesn't negotiate. May climbed into his lap, and he held her with one arm while drinking coffee with his free hand. Lillian brought him a blanket, then went to get the salve Sarah had made. The recipe was in the book, along with a note that said, Jonah never remembers gloves until his hands split. She knelt beside his chair and took one of his hands, warming it between hers before applying the salve. He went very still. You don't have to. Hush! Lillian worked the salve into the cracks gently, carefully, aware this was the first time she'd touched him with any kind of intimacy. His hands were as rough as she'd expected, scarred and calloused from years of hard work, but they were also capable and warm and real. She finished one hand and started on the other, feeling him watching her. Thank you, he said quietly. You take care of us. Someone should take care of you. May, still nestled against her father's chest, looked between them with an expression Lillian couldn't quite read. Then the child yawned and settled deeper into Jonah's arms, and the moment passed into something simpler, a family such as it was, safe together while the storm raged outside. They spent the next 3 days trapped inside by weather that seemed determined to prove its dominance. Lillian learned what winter really meant in Wyoming, not the decorative snow of New York that got swept away by morning, but cold that bit through walls and wind that found every crack and storms that could bury a man before he walked 100 yards. She learned the rhythm of survival, keep the fire fed, keep the food coming, keep everyone occupied so cabin fever didn't set in. May taught her to play checkers using buttons and a board Jonah had carved years ago. Jonah taught them both to tie knots that might save their lives someday. Bowline, clove hitch, square knot. Lillian read to them from Sarah's Bible, choosing stories May liked, David and Goliath, Noah's Ark, Daniel in the lion's den. Stories about people who faced impossible things and survived through faith or courage, or both. On the second night, with the wind screaming around the house like something trying to get in, May asked Lillian to tell them about New York. What do you want to know? Everything. What it looked like. What you did all day. Why you left. So Lillian told them about a city so big you could walk for hours and never reach the edge. About buildings tall enough to block the sun. About crowds of people who never looked at each other. She told them about ballrooms that glittered like jewels and felt just as cold. About conversations that said nothing important and meals that tasted like obligation. About a life where everything was decided before you woke up each morning, and the only choice you had was whether to pretend you wanted what everyone said you should want. Sounds lonely, May said. It was. Very lonely. But you were pretty and rich, May pressed, trying to understand. Isn't that supposed to make you happy? Lillian smiled sadly. That's what everyone told me. But being pretty just meant people looked at you without seeing you, and being rich just meant you had expensive things that didn't matter. Jonah, who'd been listening quietly from his chair, spoke up. What did matter? Lillian met his eyes across the firelight. Being real, being useful, being with people who said what they meant and meant what they said. That mattered. And is that what you found here? The question hung in the air between them, weighted with more meaning than the words alone. Lillian thought about the past weeks. The burned bread and blistered hands, the silent child who was learning to speak, the grieving man who was learning to hope. The hard work and harder weather and the strange growing sense that she'd finally found the place where she fit. Yes, she said simply. That's exactly what I found here. May smiled and settled against Jonah's shoulder, satisfied with the answer. But Jonah kept looking at Lillian, and in his eyes she saw something that made her heart beat faster. Recognition, maybe. Or possibility. Or the slow, careful emergence of something that might eventually become love, given time and patience and courage. On the third day the storm broke. Lillian woke to silence, not the absence of sound, but the presence of peace. She went to the window and found the world transformed again, this time into something beautiful rather than dangerous. The sun was rising over fresh snow that sparkled like diamonds, and the sky was so blue it hurt to look at. Jonah was already outside, digging paths to the barn and corral. Lillian dressed quickly and went to help, and together they worked in the cold, bright morning, moving snow and checking on animals and reclaiming their small piece of the world from winter's grip. May came out eventually, bundled like a small bear, and threw snowballs that mostly missed while Jonah and Lillian worked. First big storm of the season, Jonah said, leaning on his shovel to catch his breath. Won't be the last. How many more? Could be a dozen before spring, could be more. He looked at her carefully. Still think you want to stay? Lillian planted her own shovel in the snow. Jonah Hale, I didn't survive 3 days trapped in a house with you to give up at the first sign of more weather. Yes, I want to stay. He studied her face, and slowly, so slowly, he smiled. Not the almost smile she'd seen before, but a real smile. The kind that changed his whole face and let her see the man he might have been before grief carved him down to essentials. All right then, he said. All right. That night, after May was asleep and the house was quiet, Jonah didn't immediately retreat to the barn. Instead, he sat by the fire across from Lillian, and they talked, really talked, for the first time since she'd arrived. He told her about growing up on a homestead in Montana, about meeting Sarah at a harvest dance, about building this ranch with his own hands and Sarah's unwavering faith that they could make a life in this hard country. She was fearless, he said, staring into the flames. Not because she wasn't afraid, but because she looked fear in the eye and decided to live anyway. When she got sick, his voice caught. She knew she was dying. Doctor told her there was nothing to be done, and she just nodded and said, well, then I better make the time I have count. She spent her last 3 months teaching May everything she could, writing down recipes, showing her how to plant and sow and be strong. She was preparing May to live without her. Lillian's throat was tight. She sounds extraordinary. She was. Jonah looked at Lillian then, his eyes bright with unshed tears. And I killed her. Every day I work it through my head, trying to figure out what I did wrong. If I'd gotten the doctor sooner, if I'd taken her to Cheyenne, if I'd done something different. Jonah, no. Lillian moved to kneel beside his chair, taking his hands in hers. You can't carry that. Disease isn't something you cause with the wrong choices. It's just something that happens, and it's cruel and unfair, but it's not your fault. She was my wife. My job was to protect her. Your job was to love her, and you did. She knew that. May knows that. You have to know that too. He looked at their joined hands, and she saw him struggling with something, the desire to believe her fighting against years of carefully constructed guilt. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. I'm afraid to trust this. Afraid to trust you. Not because of anything you've done, but because losing Sarah nearly destroyed me, and losing May would finish the job. If I let myself care about you, really care, and then you leave or something happens, I don't think I'd survive it. Lillian squeezed his hands. I can't promise nothing bad will ever happen. This life doesn't allow for those kinds of promises. But I can promise I'm not going anywhere by choice. I'm here, Jonah, for as long as you'll have me. He lifted one hand and touched her face, gently, like she might disappear if he pressed too hard. I don't know how to do this. How to let someone in again. Neither do I. We'll figure it out together. They stayed like that for a long moment, touching gently in the firelight, two broken people trying to figure out how to be whole. Then May's voice called out from her room. A bad dream, maybe, or just the need for reassurance. Jonah stood, squeezed Lillian's hand once, and went to his daughter. Lillian sat alone by the fire, her heart full of something she was afraid to name but couldn't deny. She'd come to Wyoming running from a life that was killing her by inches. She'd expected to find work, purpose, maybe a kind of peace. She hadn't expected to find this. A man learning to live again, a child learning to speak, and a future that felt less like obligation and more like choice. When Jonah returned, May was with him, wrapped in her quilt and looking small and sleepy. She wants you, Jonah said quietly. May reached for Lillian, and Lillian took her into her arms, settling into the rocking chair with the child curled against her chest. Jonah sat nearby, and together they stayed like that. Not quite a family yet, but something close. Something that might become a family if they were brave enough to let it. Tell me about the mountains, May whispered. The ones in New York. New York doesn't have mountains like these, sweetheart. It has buildings that reach up to the sky, but they're made of stone and steel, not snow and pine. Do you miss them? The buildings? Lillian looked at Jonah, then down at the child in her arms. No, I don't miss them at all. May nodded against her chest. Good. 'Cause we need you here. Pa needs you. I need you. I need you too, little bird. Both of you. Jonah's eyes met hers over May's head, and in them she saw everything he wasn't ready to say out loud yet. Gratitude and hope, and the first fragile threads of something deeper. He nodded once, and she nodded back, and the promise between them was clearer than any words could make it. They sat together until May fell asleep, then Jonah carried her to bed. When he returned, Lillian was still in the rocking chair, and he moved to stand beside it. Sarah used to rock her like that, he said softly. May hasn't let anyone hold her that way since she died. Is that all right, that she let me? It's more than all right. Jonah paused, choosing his words carefully. For 2 years, I've been trying to be both parents to her, trying to be enough. But I'm not enough. I can feed her and keep her safe and teach her to survive, but I can't give her what she needs to really live. I think maybe you can. I'm not trying to replace Sarah. I know, but maybe May needs more than a memory. Maybe we both do. He offered his hand to help her stand. Come on, you should rest. Tomorrow we'll start digging out properly. Lillian took his hand and stood, and they were suddenly very close, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, smell the wood smoke and leather that seemed to be his permanent scent. For a heartbeat, she thought he might kiss her. For a heartbeat, she wanted him to. But he stepped back, maintaining the careful distance they'd both agreed to, and the moment passed. Still, something had shifted. Some wall had cracked a little wider, and through that crack, light was flooding in. Good night, Lillian. Good night, Jonah. He left for the barn, and she went to her room, and outside the stars burned cold and bright over the snow-covered valley. Winter had come to Wyoming, fierce and unforgiving, but inside the house, something warmer was growing, tentative and fragile, but undeniably real. It would take time. It would take patience. But for the first time since Sarah's death, Jonah Hale was allowing himself to hope. And for the first time in her life, Lillian Whitmore understood what it meant to build something worth keeping. The hard part was just beginning, but the hardest part, the choosing to try, was done. The weeks that followed the first storm settled into a rhythm that felt almost like contentment. Lillian learned to read the sky the way Jonah did, recognizing when gray clouds meant snow coming and when they meant just cold. She learned to split kindling without hitting her thumb more than once a day, to make biscuits that didn't require soaking in coffee to be edible, and to anticipate what needed doing before being told. The ranch work became less of a battle against her own ignorance and more of a conversation with the land, and slowly she began to understand why people chose this harsh, beautiful life. May blossomed like something that had been waiting for the right season. She talked more each day, asked questions about everything, and started bringing Lillian small treasures she found. An interesting rock, a bird feather, a piece of bark shaped like a heart. Once she brought a drawing she'd made of the three of them standing in front of the house, and Lillian had to turn away so the child wouldn't see her tears. In May's drawing, they were holding hands, all three of them, and the sky above the house was full of birds flying. Jonah watched these changes with an expression Lillian couldn't quite read, something between relief and fear, hope and caution. He still slept in the barn most nights, still maintained careful distance, but the walls between them were developing more cracks every day. Sometimes she'd catch him watching her with May, his face unguarded, and she'd see the man he used to be trying to emerge from behind the armor of grief. Sometimes, when their hands brushed reaching for the same dish or their shoulders touched while working side by side, the contact would linger just a moment too long to be accidental. They were circling something neither of them knew how to name. It all came to a head on a morning in late November when Lillian came out of her room to find Jonah sitting at the table, staring at a letter like it might bite him. May was still asleep, and the house was wrapped in the particular quiet of early dawn. "What is it?" Lillian asked, moving to the stove to start coffee. Jonah didn't look up. "Letter from Sarah's sister, Emma, lives in Cheyenne." He was quiet for a moment. "She's heard I got married, wants to come visit, see how May's doing." The way he said it made Lillian's stomach tighten. "You don't sound pleased." "Emma's good people. She loved Sarah, loves May." He finally looked at Lillian, and she saw the conflict in his eyes. "But she's going to have opinions about this arrangement, about you, about whether it's appropriate for May to be raised by a stranger." "I'm not exactly a stranger anymore." "You know what I mean." Jonah set the letter down carefully. "Emma wanted to take May after Sarah died. Offered to raise her in Cheyenne, send her to proper school, give her opportunities she won't have out here. I said no. Told her May needed to stay on the ranch with me, where her mother's buried, where she knows the land." Lillian poured coffee for both of them, then sat across from him. "But you wondered if you made the right choice." "Every day. May's bright, she deserves education, society, things I can't give her, but she also needs roots, needs to know where she comes from." He wrapped his hands around his cup. "When I wrote to Emma about getting married, I thought it would settle things. Show her May has a woman's influence, that we're managing fine. But now Emma's coming, and she's going to see through this in about 5 minutes." "See through what, exactly?" Jonah met her eyes. "That this isn't a real marriage. That you sleep in one room, I sleep in the barn, and we're play acting at being a family because it's convenient." The words landed like stones. Lillian felt her face heat but kept her voice steady. "Is that what you think we're doing? Play acting?" "I don't know what we're doing." Jonah's voice was raw with frustration. "I hired you to help with May, to cook and clean and be a woman's presence in the house. But somewhere along the way it became something else, and I don't know what to call it or what to do about it." "What do you want it to be?" The question hung between them like a held breath. Jonah stared at her, and she saw him struggling with something deep and complicated, years of grief fighting against the possibility of hope. He stopped. Started again. "I want May to be happy. I want her to have a mother who actually wants to be here, not just someone doing a job. I want this house to feel like a home again instead of a place we're all just surviving in." He paused, his jaw tight. "And I want to stop sleeping in the barn like a stranger in my own life." Lillian's heart was pounding. "Then stop. It's not that simple." "Why not?" "Because—" Jonah stood abruptly, moving to the window, putting distance between them. "Because if I let myself want this, really want it, and then it falls apart, I won't survive it. I barely survived losing Sarah. I can't do that again." Lillian stood too, moving to him but not touching. "Jonah, look at me." He turned, and she saw the naked fear in his eyes. "I'm not Sarah," Lillian said quietly. "I'm not trying to be her, and I'm not going to die and leave you alone. But I'm also not going to keep living in this house like a ghost, pretending we don't mean anything to each other when we both know that's a lie. We barely know each other. We spent every day together for 2 months, I've watched you work yourself to exhaustion to keep this place running. I've seen you with May, the way you love her so fiercely it hurts to witness. I've learned your silences and your almost smiles, and the way you hold yourself like you're afraid to take up too much space in your own life. She stepped closer. You know me too. You've seen me fail at everything and keep trying. You've seen me with May, the way I love her like she's mine. You've watched me choose this life every single day when I could have left. Lillian, I'm not finished. Her voice was shaking but determined. Emma can come visit. She can judge me all she wants, but she's going to see a family, Jonah. Maybe not a conventional one, maybe not one that looks like what we're supposed to be, but a real family. Because that's what we've become, whether you're brave enough to admit it or not. The silence that followed was enormous. Through the window, dawn was breaking over the mountains, painting the snow pink and gold. In her room, May stirred, making small waking sounds. The stove crackled. And Jonah Hale stood frozen, staring at Lillian like she'd just said something either terrible or miraculous. I'm afraid, he whispered. I know. So am I. Lillian reached for his hand, and this time he didn't pull away. But I'm more afraid of wasting this, whatever this is, because we're too scared to try. Jonah looked down at their joined hands, and something in his face cracked open. Sarah would have liked you. You're stubborn like she was, brave like she was. He looked up, and his eyes were wet. She'd want me to be happy, I know that. But it feels like betrayal, being happy without her. It's not betrayal. It's survival. It's choosing life even when grief tells you not to. Lillian squeezed his hand. And maybe it's honoring her memory by being the kind of father and husband she'd be proud of, instead of the ghost you've become. Before Jonah could respond, May's door opened and the child emerged, hair wild from sleep, rubbing her eyes. She stopped when she saw them standing so close, holding hands, and her face went through several emotions very quickly. Surprise, understanding, and finally something that looked like pure relief. Are you two finally figuring it out? May asked, her voice carrying the exasperation of a 6-year-old who'd been waiting for adults to catch up to what she'd known all along. Despite everything, Lillian laughed. We're working on it, sweetheart. Good, 'cause it's been real awkward watching you dance around each other. May moved to the table and climbed into her chair, completely matter-of-fact. When's breakfast? Jonah stared at his daughter, then at Lillian, then back at May. How long have you been waiting for us to figure it out? Forever. You're both real slow about feelings. May looked at them seriously. Ma told me before she died that Pa would find someone new someday, and I shouldn't be sad about it. She said love doesn't run out just because you give it to more people. She said it grows. Jonah sat down heavily, like his legs had stopped working. Your mother said that to you? She said lots of things. She knew she was dying, Pa. She wanted to make sure I knew it was okay to be happy after she was gone. May reached for his hand. She wanted you to be happy too. She told me to tell you that when the time was right. And you think the time's right now? May looked at Lillian, then back at her father. I think the time's been right for weeks. You're just stubborn as old leather, like Ma always said. The sound Jonah made was half laugh, half sob. He pulled May into his lap and held her tight, his face buried in her hair, and Lillian saw his shoulders shaking. May wrapped her small arms around his neck and held him while he cried, really cried, for the first time since his wife had died. Lillian turned away, giving them privacy, and busied herself with breakfast preparations. But her own tears were falling silent and steady because she understood what was happening. Jonah was finally letting go of the guilt that had kept him frozen. May was finally able to give him the gift her mother had left. And maybe, just maybe, they were all finally able to move forward together. After a while, Jonah's breathing steadied. He set May down gently and wiped his face with his sleeve, looking embarrassed. Sorry, that was human, Lillian said firmly. That was human. Don't apologize for it. He nodded, then stood and moved to Lillian. This time when he took her hand, it wasn't tentative or careful. It was sure. Emma can come visit. And when she does, she'll see what's true, that May has a home, that we're building something real here. He paused, his gray eyes holding hers. That I'm courting you proper, the way you deserve. Courting me? Lillian felt her pulse jump. We're already married. On paper. But you're right. We've been living like strangers. That needs to change. The corner of his mouth lifted in that almost smile she'd come to treasure. Assuming you're amenable to being courted by a widowed rancher with a precocious daughter and more calluses than charm, I think I can suffer through it. May, watching from the table, grinned. Does this mean Pa's moving back into the house? Jonah's face colored slightly. I'll take the small room. Lillian keeps hers, it's proper. Pa, proper is boring. May Elizabeth Hale, I'm just saying what's true. You're married. Married people don't live in barns. Despite the tension, Lillian had to suppress a smile. May wasn't wrong, but she also understood Jonah's need to do this right, to rebuild what had been broken slowly and with intention. Your father's trying to be respectful, Lillian said gently. There's no rush. May sighed dramatically but nodded. Fine, but hurry up about it. Winter's long and I'm tired of weird silences. They ate breakfast together, and the silence wasn't weird at all. It was comfortable, punctuated by May's chatter about a dream she'd had about flying horses and Jonah's quiet observations about work that needed doing before the next storm. But underneath the ordinary conversation, something fundamental had shifted. They weren't pretending anymore. They weren't hiding behind convenience or grief or fear. They were choosing each other, deliberately and out loud, and that made all the difference. That afternoon, while May was practicing her letters, Jonah moved his few belongings from the barn loft to the small room off the kitchen, the room that had originally been meant for storage but could hold a bed and not much else. It was a symbolic gesture more than anything, but symbols mattered. That night, for the first time since Lillian had arrived, all three of them slept under the same roof. Lillian lay awake in her room, listening to the sounds of the house settling, and felt something ease in her chest. This was what home sounded like. Not silence, not isolation, but the quiet breathing of people who belonged to each other, learning to live together in all the messy, complicated, beautiful ways that families did. Emma's letter arrived 3 days later, announcing she'd arrived the following week and would stay for several days to properly observe how May was being raised. The tone was polite but firm, and Lillian could read the concern between the lines. Sarah's sister wanted to make sure May wasn't being neglected or misused by a mail-order bride who'd married for convenience. She thinks I'm taking advantage, Lillian said, reading the letter over Jonah's shoulder. Emma thinks everyone's taking advantage until proven otherwise. She's protective. Can't fault her for that. Jonah folded the letter carefully. But she's going to see the truth. That May's thriving. That you love her. That this is real. What if she doesn't believe it? Jonah turned to face her, and his expression was serious. Then she'll learn that what we're building here isn't up for her approval. May's my daughter. This is my ranch, and you're my wife. In every way that matters, even if we're taking our time with the rest. He touched her face gently. Let Emma come. Let her see. She'll understand. But Lillian wasn't so sure. She spent the next week in a state of low-grade anxiety, cleaning things that were already clean, practicing conversations in her head, trying to imagine what Sarah's sister would see when she looked at this strange arrangement, a society woman playing at frontier life, a gold digger who'd trapped a lonely widower, someone using a grieving child for security. May, sensing Lillian's nervousness, took to offering reassurances that were both sweet and slightly alarming. Aunt Emma's nice, mostly. She just talks a lot and has opinions about everything. That's comforting. She'll like you, probably, unless she doesn't, but Pa won't let her take me to Cheyenne, so it'll be fine. May, that's not helping. I'm just being honest. Ma always said honesty was important. Lillian pulled the child close and kissed the top of her head. Your mother was right about most things, it seems. She was right about you, too. What do you mean? May looked up at her seriously. I had a dream last night. Ma was in it. She said to tell you that you're doing good, that she's glad you're here. The child paused. I know it was probably just a dream, but it felt real. Lillian's eyes burned. I think sometimes dreams are how people we love tell us what we need to hear. So Ma's okay with everything? With you and Pa and me being a family? I think your mother would be very proud of all of us, especially you." May nodded, satisfied, and returned to her drawing. But Lillian sat with the weight of that dream that might not be a dream and felt the blessing of a woman she'd never met settling over her shoulders like a shawl on a cold day. Emma arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in a hired wagon, accompanied by a driver who looked relieved to be leaving her in Redwood Basin and not staying for the return journey. She was a tall woman in her 40s, handsome rather than pretty, dressed in practical traveling clothes but carrying herself with unmistakable authority. Her resemblance to Sarah was startling. The same dark hair, the same direct gaze, though where May's eyes were gray like her father's, Emma's were Sarah's brown. She climbed down from the wagon, surveyed the ranch with a critical eye, and then turned that same assessment on Lillian, who stood on the porch with May tucked against her side and Jonah slightly behind them both. "So," Emma said, her voice carrying across the yard, "you're the mail-order bride." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact delivered with no judgment yet, but plenty of room for judgment to follow. Lillian lifted her chin. "I'm Lillian Hale. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Carson." "We'll see about the pleasure part." Emma's eyes moved to May. "Hello, little bird. You've grown." May lit up and ran to her aunt, throwing herself into Emma's arms with the enthusiasm of a child who genuinely loved and missed someone. Emma held her niece tight, her stern expression softening considerably, and Lillian saw the grief there. For her sister, for the niece she didn't get to see enough, for a loss that had wounded the whole family. "You look well," Emma said, holding May at arm's length to study her. "Happy, even." "I am happy, Aunt Emma. Lillian teaches me things, and Pa's less sad, and we're all figuring it out." Emma's eyes sharpened. "Lillian, is it? Not Mrs. Hale or Mother?" "Lillian's what she asked to be called," May said with the bald honesty of childhood. "She's not trying to replace Ma. She's just Lillian, and that's good enough." Emma looked from May to Lillian to Jonah, clearly calculating something. "Well, shall we go inside? I've had a long journey, and I'd appreciate some coffee while you explain to me exactly what's happening here." The next 2 hours were some of the most uncomfortable of Lillian's life. Emma sat at the kitchen table like a judge at a trial, asking questions that felt like cross-examination. How did Lillian and Jonah meet? What were the terms of their arrangement? What were Lillian's qualifications for raising a child? Did she understand the responsibility she'd taken on? What were her intentions toward the family? Lillian answered honestly, explaining her life in New York, her reasons for leaving, her initial agreement with Jonah, and how it had evolved into something neither of them had expected. She didn't embellish or try to make it sound more romantic than it was. She just told the truth, that she'd come west looking for purpose and had found family instead. Emma listened without visible reaction, though her eyes never stopped assessing. When Lillian finished, Emma turned to Jonah. "And you? What's your side of this?" Jonah, who'd been silent through most of the interrogation, straightened in his chair. "My side is that I was drowning in grief and work, and raising May alone was breaking both of us. Lillian came because I needed help. She stayed because she chose to, and somewhere in between those two things, we became something more than an arrangement." He met Emma's eyes steadily. "You want to know if I love her? I don't know yet. We're figuring that out. But I know May loves her. I know she's given my daughter back her voice and her smile. I know this house feels like a home again instead of a tomb, and I know that's worth more than any conventional marriage you could approve of." Emma was quiet for a long moment, then she looked at May, who'd been listening intently. "And you, little bird, what do you think of all this?" May didn't hesitate. "I think Ma would like Lillian. I think Pa's happier than he's been since Ma died. And I think Aunt Emma should stop worrying and just have dinner with us so she can see we're doing okay." Despite everything, Emma's lips twitched. "You've got your mother's directness. I'll give you that." She sighed, and some of the severity left her face. "All right, I'll stay for dinner. And a few days after that. But I'm watching Lillian Hale. My sister trusted me to look after her family, and I intend to honor that trust." "I wouldn't expect anything less," Lillian said quietly. That night they shared a meal that was simple but good, and Emma began to relax enough to tell stories about Sarah. How she'd been fearless as a child, climbing trees the boys were afraid of. How she'd fallen in love with Jonah at first sight and pursued him with shameless determination. How she'd faced her death with the same courage she'd faced everything else. She made me promise something, Emma said as the evening wore on and May had fallen asleep in Lillian's lap. She made me promise that if Jonah ever found someone new, I wouldn't make it difficult. She said he'd need permission to move forward, and I should give it to him. Emma's eyes were bright with tears. I'm trying to honor that promise, but it's hard watching someone else sit in her chair, care for her daughter, take her place. Lillian shifted May gently. I'm not taking her place, Mrs. Carson. I'm just filling the space she left behind the best I know how. No one could replace Sarah. But life goes on, and May needs more than grief and memory. She needs love in the present tense. Emma looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Sarah would have said something very like that. She stood, gathering her shawl. I should rest. We'll talk more tomorrow. After Emma retired to May's room, May would sleep with Lillian for the duration of the visit. Jonah walked Lillian to her door. You did well today, he said quietly. Emma's difficult, but she's fair. She'll come around. I hope so, for May's sake. For all our sakes. Jonah hesitated, then reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind Lillian's ear, his touch gentle. Thank you for fighting for this. For us. I'm not fighting. I'm just being honest about what I want. And what do you want? Lillian looked up at him, this hard, complicated man who was learning to be soft again, and felt her heart expand. I want May to grow up whole. I want you to stop carrying guilt like it's your job. And I want us to be a real family, not just people surviving in the same house. Jonah smiled, a real smile, full and unguarded. Then we want the same things. He leaned down and kissed her forehead, gentle as prayer, and Lillian felt the promise in it. They were taking their time, building slowly, but they were building towards something real. When Lillian finally lay down with May sleeping beside her and Emma in the next room and Jonah in his small room by the kitchen, she felt something she hadn't felt in years, certainty. They would be all right. Whatever Emma decided, whatever challenges came next, they would face them together. Because they'd chosen each other. And that choice, made daily and deliberately, was stronger than any doubt. Emma stayed for 5 days, and each one felt like a test Lillian hadn't studied for. The woman watched everything, how Lillian moved through the kitchen, how she spoke to May, how she and Jonah navigated the careful space between married and courting. Emma asked questions that seemed casual but weren't, observed silences that felt weighted with judgment, and maintained an expression that gave away nothing of what she was thinking. On the third morning, Lillian found Emma in the barn before dawn, standing in front of the stall that held Jonah's sorrel gelding. The older woman wasn't doing anything, just standing there with her hand on the worn wood, and something about her posture made Lillian's chest tighten. This was Sarah's favorite place, Emma said without turning around. When things got hard or she needed to think, she'd come out here and talk to the horses, said they were better listeners than most people. Lillian moved closer but kept her distance. I can leave if you want privacy. No, stay. Emma finally turned, and in the dim light of early morning, she looked older than her years. I need to tell you something, and I'd rather do it without Jonah or May around. Lillian braced herself for whatever judgment was coming. My sister died slowly, Emma said, her voice steady but raw. 3 months from diagnosis to death, and every day she got a little weaker, a little more transparent. But her mind stayed sharp until the very end, and she used that time to prepare everyone for a world without her in it. Emma's hands gripped the stall door. She made lists: how to treat May's croup, when to plant the garden, which horses needed gentling, how Jonah took his coffee. She wrote it all down like she could leave instructions for living, and we'd just follow them and be fine. The receipt book, Lillian said quietly. Part of it. She wrote letters too. One for May to open on her wedding day. One for Jonah that I'm not supposed to give him until he remarries. Emma looked at Lillian directly. She wrote one for me too. Want to know what it said? Lillian wasn't sure, but she nodded. It said, Emma, you're going to want to protect them by keeping them frozen in the past. Don't. Let them grow. Let them change. Let them find happiness that doesn't include me, and be glad for it instead of threatened by it. Emma's voice cracked. She knew me better than I knew myself, knew I'd try to preserve her memory by making sure nothing changed. You love them. That's not wrong. It's not love if it keeps them from living. Emma moved away from the stall, pacing the barn aisle. When Jonah wrote that he was getting married, I was furious. It felt like betrayal, like he was erasing Sarah. I came here ready to find fault with everything, to prove that May needed to come to Cheyenne where I could keep her safe and unchanged. And now? Emma stopped pacing and looked at Lillian with something like defeat mixed with reluctant respect. Now I see a child who laughs. I see a man who stopped punishing himself for surviving. I see a house that feels lived in instead of haunted. She paused. I see you trying so hard to be what they need while still being yourself. And I realize Sarah was right. Change isn't betrayal. It's life. Lillian felt tears prick her eyes. I'm not trying to erase her. I swear I'm not. I know. That's what took me 3 days to understand. You're not trying to be Sarah. You're just trying to be Lillian, and somehow that's exactly what they need. Emma came closer, studying Lillian's face. My sister had a gift for seeing people clearly, for knowing what they needed before they knew themselves. When Jonah wrote to you, I think maybe she guided his hand. I think she chose you for them. Mrs. Carson, Emma. If you're family, call me Emma. The older woman's stern expression finally cracked into something softer. I came here to judge you, to find you lacking, to rescue May from a mistake. But you're not a mistake. You're an answer to a prayer I didn't know how to pray. Lillian couldn't hold back the tears anymore. Emma pulled her into a hug that smelled like Sarah's lavender soap. She must have brought it from Cheyenne, and held her while she cried. Two women who loved the same family, separated by grief and circumstance, finally finding common ground. Thank you, Lillian whispered against Emma's shoulder, for giving us a chance. Thanks, Sarah. She's the one who taught me that love grows instead of divides. Emma pulled back, wiping her own eyes. Now come on. We have a child to feed and a stubborn man to convince that he deserves happiness. They walked back to the house together as dawn broke pink and gold over the mountains, and Lillian felt a weight lift that she hadn't known she was carrying. Emma's approval mattered, not because Lillian needed permission to love this family, but because May deserved to have her whole family supporting her, not torn between competing loyalties. At breakfast, Emma was different. She asked May about her lessons with genuine interest, complimented Lillian's biscuits without reservation, and told Jonah directly that he looked better than he had in 2 years. The relief on Jonah's face was almost painful to witness. So you're not taking May to Cheyenne? He asked carefully. No. May belongs here. With you, with Lillian. This is her home. Emma set down her coffee cup. But I do want her to visit sometimes. I want her to know her mother's family, to have connections beyond this valley. That's fair, Jonah agreed. Summer, maybe? When the ranch can spare us both for a week or two? Emma's eyes widened. Both? You think I'm letting my wife and daughter travel alone? Jonah reached for Lillian's hand on the table, the gesture casual and claiming at once. Where they go, I go. We're a family. The word hung in the air. Family. And May beamed so brightly she could have lit the room. Emma looked between them and nodded slowly, her expression satisfied. A family. Yes, Sarah would be pleased. She paused. There's something I need to give you. I was going to wait until I decided whether you deserved it, but I think my sister's been patient enough. Emma left the table and returned with a small wooden box Lillian recognized from her belongings. She opened it and withdrew an envelope, yellowed with age and sealed with wax. Sarah's handwriting on the front read, "For Jonah, when he's ready to love again." Jonah went pale. Emma, I don't think... She wanted you to have this. She made me promise. Emma held out the letter. It's time, Jonah. More than time. Jonah took the letter with shaking hands. He stared at it for a long moment, then looked at Lillian. Would you come with me when I read it? Lillian nodded, not trusting her voice. They left Emma and May at the table and walked outside into the cold December morning. Jonah led her to the small fenced area behind the barn where Sarah was buried, marked by a simple wooden cross and surrounded by stones Jonah had carefully placed. He stood there, holding his wife's last letter, and Lillian stood beside him, her hand in his. "I'm afraid," he admitted. "Afraid of what she'll say. Afraid I'm not ready. Afraid I'll never be ready." "She loved you enough to write this knowing you'd need it. That's a gift, Jonah. Don't refuse it out of fear." He nodded and broke the seal with careful fingers. The letter was 2 pages, covered in Sarah's neat script. Jonah read silently, and Lillian watched his face change. Grief and love and pain, and finally, something like peace. When he finished, he was crying quietly, tears running down his weathered face. He handed the letter to Lillian without a word, and she read, "My dearest Jonah, if Emma's given you this letter, it means you've found someone new. I'm glad. I'm so glad. You were never meant to be alone, and May needs a mother who's present, not just remembered. I know you're feeling guilty right now. You're probably thinking you should have waited longer, loved me better, been more faithful to my memory. Stop it. I don't want your guilt. I want your happiness. I want you to live the life I can't live with you anymore. I want you to love someone who can grow old beside you, who can watch May become a woman, who can fill this house with sound and life and all the things death stole from us. You gave me 7 beautiful years. Let someone else have the rest. And know that I'm not gone. Not really. I'm in May's smile, and in the mountains we loved, and in every sunset over this valley. I'm in the recipe book, and the quilts I sewed, and the garden I planted. You're not betraying me by moving forward. You're honoring me by refusing to let grief win. Be happy, my love. Be ridiculously, messily, completely happy. You deserve it. May deserves it. And whoever you've chosen deserves a man who can love her without shadows. I release you from mourning. I free you to live. And I thank you, with everything I was and everything I'll always be, for the gift of loving you. Tell May I'm proud of her. Tell yourself I'm proud of you too. And tell your new wife that she's got impossible shoes to fill, but I believe she's up to the challenge. Love generously, laugh often, and remember, the opposite of death isn't survival. It's living, so live. All my love, always and forever, Sarah. Lillian's hands were shaking by the time she finished. She looked at Jonah and saw him staring at his wife's grave with an expression of such profound release that it hurt to witness. "She set me free," he whispered. "I've been holding on to guilt for 2 years, and she set me free before she even died." "She loved you that much." "She did. She really did." Jonah turned to Lillian, taking both her hands in his. "And I think I'm ready now. Ready to love someone that much again. Ready to stop surviving and start living." He paused, his gray eyes holding hers. "I think I'm ready to love you, Lillian. Not because you're convenient or helpful or good with May, though you're all those things, but because you're brave and honest, and you chose this broken family when you could have had anything, because you make me want to be the man Sarah believed I could be." Lillian's tears were falling fast now. "I love you too. I think I have for weeks. I was just waiting for you to catch up." Jonah laughed, a real, full laugh that Lillian had never heard from him before. It transformed his face, erased years of grief, and let her see the man he'd been before loss carved him hollow. He pulled her close and kissed her, gentle at first and then deeper, and it felt like a promise and a beginning and a choice all at once. When they finally pulled apart, they were both breathless. Jonah rested his forehead against hers, his hands cradling her face. "I want to do this right," he said. "I want to court you properly, even though we're already married. I want to take you to town and let everyone see us together. I want to dance with you at the spring social. I want to give May a family she can be proud of." "She's already proud, so am I." "Then let's make it official. Let's be married in truth, not just on paper." He pulled back slightly. "I know we already said vows in front of a justice of the peace, but that was practical. This time I want it to mean something." "It already means something. Then let's make it mean everything." They walked back to the house hand in hand, and when they entered the kitchen, May took one look at their faces and let out a whoop of triumph. "Finally! I thought you two were going to dance around it forever." Emma smiled, her stern expression completely dissolved into warmth. About time. Sarah was getting impatient, I'm sure. That afternoon, Emma insisted on a proper family discussion about what came next. They gathered around the table, all four of them, and talked honestly about the future. Emma would return to Cheyenne, but would visit regularly. May would have proper schooling, either from Lillian or eventually from the school teacher when one could be found for Redwood Basin. Jonah and Lillian would work the ranch together, partners in every sense. And they would honor Sarah's memory not by preserving the past, but by building a future she would have blessed. There's one more thing, Emma said as the conversation wound down. She looked at May. I have something for you from your mother. She wanted you to have it when you were ready to accept a new mother figure in your life. Emma retrieved another small box and handed it to May. Inside was a delicate gold locket on a chain. May opened it with careful fingers and found two miniature portraits inside. One of Sarah, one of Jonah. Your mother wore this every day, Emma explained. She wanted you to have it so you could keep your parents close to your heart always, both of them. She looked at Lillian. Sarah knew Jonah would remarry. She wanted May to understand that having two mothers, one in memory, one in life, wasn't betrayal. It was blessing. May looked at the locket, then at Lillian, then back at the locket. Will you help me put it on? Lillian's hand shook as she fastened the chain around May's small neck. The child touched the locket reverently, then threw her arms around Lillian's waist. I love you, May whispered. And Ma would have loved you too. I know she would. I love you too, sweetheart. So much. Jonah was watching them with naked emotion on his face, and Emma was crying openly, and for a moment the kitchen was full of all the complicated, messy, beautiful feelings that made a family real. That night, after Emma had retired and May was asleep, Jonah asked Lillian to walk with him. They bundled up against the December cold and walked to the ridge where she'd first seen the ranch months ago, when everything was uncertain and terrifying and new. The valley spread below them, silver with moonlight, peaceful and wild in equal measure. Jonah put his arm around Lillian's shoulders, and she leaned into his warmth, and they stood together looking at the life they were building. When spring comes, Jonah said quietly, I want to plant a garden with you. Sarah's garden grew over after she died. I couldn't bear to tend it, but I think it's time to start growing things again. I'd like that. And I want to build a swing for May, under that big elm by the creek. Sarah always said we should, but we never got around to it. We'll build it together. And I want to kiss you goodnight every evening and wake up knowing you're the first person I'll see. He turned to face her fully. I want to marry you again, Lillian, properly, with May as witness and whatever neighbors we can gather and words that mean forever. Will you? Lillian looked up at this man who'd been broken and was learning to be whole, who'd been frozen and was learning to thaw, who'd been surviving and was learning to live. Yes, 1,000 times yes. He kissed her under the stars, and it felt like sealing a covenant. When they walked back to the house hand in hand, Lillian felt the rightness of it settle into her bones. This was where she belonged. This was home, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. Over the next 2 months, winter deepened its grip on Wyoming, but inside the ranch house, warmth grew. Jonah moved his belongings from the small room to Lillian's room, their room now, and the awkwardness Lillian had feared never materialized. They were married, after all, and what had seemed complicated became simple once they stopped fighting it. May flourished like a plant finally getting enough sun. She talked constantly, asked questions about everything, and started drawing pictures of a future that included all of them. She drew Lillian teaching her to sew. She drew Jonah teaching her to ride. She drew the three of them planting the garden in spring. She drew a baby in a cradle, which made Lillian blush and Jonah grin, and when Lillian gently asked if May would like a brother or sister someday, the child's enthusiastic yes made them both laugh. In February, during a brief warm spell, they held their second wedding. The preacher from Redwood Basin came to the ranch, along with Emma, who'd made the journey from Cheyenne, and the handful of neighbors who lived within riding distance. It was simple and quick. No elaborate ceremony, no fancy dress, just two people standing in front of witnesses and promising to love each other through whatever came next. May stood beside them, holding a bouquet of dried wildflowers. And when the preacher asked who gave this woman to be married, May piped up with Ma does, and I do too, which made everyone laugh and cry at once. Jonah kissed his wife with more enthusiasm than was probably proper for a church ceremony, and the neighbors cheered, and May hugged them both so hard she nearly knocked them over. Emma watched with tears streaming down her face, and later she told Lillian that she'd felt Sarah's presence there, blessing the union, releasing them all to move forward. That night, after the guests had left and May was finally asleep after an exciting day, Jonah and Lillian sat by the fire in their night clothes, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist. "Are you happy?" he asked quietly. "Happier than I knew was possible." "No regrets about leaving New York?" Lillian thought about the mansion, the ballrooms, the life that had felt like slowly drowning in silk. "Not even for a moment. That wasn't living. This is living." "Even the hard parts?" "Especially the hard parts. They're what make the good parts matter." She shifted to look at him. "What about you? Any regrets about the mail-order bride who couldn't cook?" Jonah smiled and kissed her temple. "Best decision I ever made. Well, second best. First was saying yes when Sarah asked me to dance at that harvest social. Second was writing to you." "What would Sarah think of us?" "I think she'd say we took too long to figure it out. But she's glad we got there eventually." He was quiet for a moment. "I used to think loving someone new would diminish what Sarah and I had. But it doesn't. It's just different. Big enough for all of it. The past and the present and the future." May said love grows instead of running out. Smart kid. She gets it from her parents, both of them. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire, feeling the peace that came from hard-won contentment. Outside, winter still held the valley in its grip, but inside, spring was already beginning. Not in the calendar or the weather, but in their hearts. When March arrived with its promise of thaw, they started working the garden plot. Jonah turned the soil while Lillian and May planned what to plant, using Sarah's notes as guidance, but adding their own ideas too. They would grow what Sarah had grown, beans and squash and potatoes, but they'd add new things too. Lillian wanted herbs for cooking. May wanted sunflowers because they were cheerful. "We're not replacing Ma's garden," May said seriously as they worked. "We're just growing it bigger. That's okay, right?" "That's more than okay, sweetheart. That's perfect." The day they planted the first seeds, May insisted on saying a prayer. She stood between Jonah and Lillian, holding both their hands, and spoke to the sky. "Ma, we're planting the garden again. Lillian's helping, and Pa's helping, and I'm helping too. I think you'd like what we're doing. I think you'd be happy." She paused. "Thank you for sending Lillian to us. Thank you for telling Pa it was okay to love her. We miss you, but we're okay now. We're more than okay. We're a family." Lillian couldn't see through her tears, and Jonah was gripping her hand so tight it hurt. But it was the good kind of hurt, the kind that meant something real was happening. In April, Jonah built the swing. He hung it from the strongest branch of the old elm by the creek, testing it carefully to make sure it would hold. May was the first to try it, and her delighted laughter echoed across the valley as Jonah pushed her higher and higher. "Watch me, Lillian! I'm flying!" And she was, hair streaming behind her, face tilted toward the sky, completely unafraid. Lillian watched and remembered the silent, careful child she'd first met, and marveled at the transformation. May hadn't lost her mother's memory by learning to laugh again. She'd honored it by refusing to stay frozen. That evening, as the sun set fire to the mountains and May dozed against Lillian's shoulder, Jonah pulled a small box from his pocket. "I know we're already married, twice now, but I wanted you to have this." Inside was a simple gold band, worn smooth with age. Lillian recognized it immediately from Sarah's recipe book, from the photographs Emma had shown her. Sarah's wedding ring. "Jonah, I can't." "Emma gave it to me. She said Sarah would want you to have it, not to replace her, but to continue what she started, to be part of the chain of women who've loved this family." He took the ring and slid it onto Lillian's finger where it fit perfectly. "You're May's mother now, in every way that matters. You're my wife, in every way that matters. This ring represents that. You're not borrowing our family, you're part of it. Forever." Lillian looked at the ring through her tears, feeling the weight of it, the history, the love it represented. "Thank you for trusting me with this, with all of it." Thank you for choosing us, for staying when it was hard, for loving a broken man and a silent child and turning us into a family again. May stirred against Lillian's shoulder and mumbled sleepily, "Are you two being mushy again?" "Extremely mushy," Jonah confirmed. "Good. You should be mushy more often. Ma would approve." May settled back into sleep, completely secure, completely loved. They sat together on the porch as the darkness fell and stars emerged, one by one, in the vast Wyoming sky. Lillian thought about the telegram that had arrived on her wedding day, about the choice she'd made to board that westbound train, about every moment of doubt and fear and hope that had led her here. She'd left New York looking for something real. She'd found it in the most unexpected place, in a silent house with a grieving man and a wounded child, in hard work and harder weather, in learning to fail and trying again, in the slow, patient building of trust and eventually love. The mountains stood eternal against the darkening sky. The creek sang its endless song. And on the porch of a small ranch in Wyoming territory, a family sat together, stitched from loss and choice and the stubborn insistence that life was worth living, even when it hurt. Lillian Whitmore had boarded a train looking for herself. She'd found herself and so much more. She'd found home. Not the place, though the ranch was home too, but the people. Jonah, who'd learned to love again. May, who'd learned to speak again. And herself, who'd learned what it meant to be necessary, useful, loved. "What are you thinking?" Jonah asked softly. Lillian smiled in the darkness. "I'm thinking I'd do it all again, every hard moment, every mistake, every fear, because they all led here. To Wyoming? To you, to May, to this." She squeezed his hand. "To home." May stirred once more and said, without opening her eyes, "Will you sing something? Like Ma used to?" Lillian looked at Jonah, who nodded encouragement. She'd never been much of a singer, but she understood what May was asking for. Not perfection, but presence. Not Sarah's songs, but sound to fill the silence. So Lillian sang, soft and slightly off-key, a lullaby her own mother had sung to her a lifetime ago. May relaxed completely, and Jonah's arm tightened around Lillian's shoulders, and somewhere in the darkness, Lillian imagined Sarah Hale smiling. The song ended, but the peace remained. They sat together under the stars, three people who'd found each other across impossible distance and chosen to become family. Not despite their brokenness, but because of it. Not in spite of loss, but through it. The wind carried the scent of sage and pine. The creek murmured its ancient poetry, and in a small house in a vast valley, beneath mountains that had witnessed 1,000,000 human stories, this particular story found its ending, which was really just another beginning. Lillian Whitmore had left everything behind to find herself. What she found instead was better than anything she could have imagined. She found purpose and partnership and love that asked nothing except that she be herself, fully and without apology. She found home. And home, she learned, wasn't a place you came from. It was the place you chose, and the people who chose you back. And in that choosing, in that daily commitment to stay and try and love despite the fear, that was where life actually lived. Not in perfection, not in safety, not in the absence of pain, but in the brave, messy, beautiful practice of showing up for each other, day after day, until showing up became its own kind of forever. And they lived that forever, one day at a time, together.